Chapter 1. The Shattered Night by Puget Sound. Abigail Harper stood frozen in the middle of the banquet hall at the Fairmont Olympic, her champagne glass shattering at her feet as Ethan Caldwell, her fiancé, walked in hand with Natalie Pierce, declaring, "Abigail, I can't marry you. Natalie is my future." The sound of breaking glass rang out sharply, cutting through the gentle piano melody lingering in the air. And in that moment, Abigail's entire world seemed to stop turning. The glass splintered into tiny glittering fragments under the chandelier's light, just like her heart, shattered beyond repair. She stood there, her hands trembling, the shimmering silver evening gown now feeling foreign, no longer hers. Her green eyes widened, searching for a sign, an explanation from Ethan, but his face was cold, unmoved, as if she had never meant anything in his life. The banquet hall at the Fairmont Olympic glowed brilliantly, crystal chandeliers hanging high from the ceiling, reflecting through large windows overlooking Puget Sound, where the city lights danced on the dark water. The distinctive Seattle coffee scent, a rich aroma from beans roasted right in the city, mingled with expensive perfume and freshly baked pastries, creating an upscale atmosphere Abigail once thought of as home. The piano glided softly through Clair de Lune, gentle as a sea breeze blowing across the Sound, but now it only made her feel more suffocated. Abigail, 28 years old, had spent the entire evening preparing for this moment, the night she and Ethan would announce their engagement before Seattle's tech elite, her family, and hundreds of distinguished guests. The silver gown hugged her body, the high heels pinched her feet, all to be perfect for the night she thought would shape her future. The Harper family wasn't just wealthy. They were one of the pillars of Seattle's tech industry. Harper Tech, the software conglomerate founded by her father, Richard Harper, had turned programming ideas into billions of dollars. And her mother, Evelyn Harper, was the steely woman behind the social strategies that upheld the family's reputation. They had arranged this relationship with Ethan Caldwell 2 years ago, when he was still a promising startup entrepreneur in South Lake Union, the city's tech hub. Ethan, with his neatly trimmed blonde hair and icy blue eyes, was always busy with meetings at his startup headquarters, but he had never let Abigail down. "I'll be there on time, Abby," he'd often say over the phone, his warm, convincing voice reassuring her, and she believed him, believed he loved her, believed he'd be the perfect husband her family expected. But now, as he stood there, his hand clasped tightly with Natalie Pierce's, all those promises turned to ash. The heavy wooden doors of the hall had swung open seconds earlier, and every eye in the room turned toward the entrance. Abigail had smiled, her heart beating faster, thinking Ethan had finally arrived, though later than expected. But her smile froze when she saw he wasn't alone. Natalie Pierce, daughter of Charles Pierce, the renowned venture capital mogul in Seattle, walked beside him, haughty in a fiery red dress that clung to her body, her sleek black hair cascading down like a declaration of war. The crowd began to murmur, whispers rippling like waves across Puget Sound. A nearby waiter stood still, forgetting to pour champagne, letting it spill onto the pristine white tablecloth. Cameras from the press, invited to capture the engagement moment, started flashing, the bursts of light blinding Abigail, but she couldn't move. Natalie smirked, her red lips curling smugly, while Ethan just looked at her, his blue eyes devoid of emotion. "Abigail, I can't marry you," he repeated, his voice flat, like he was reading a business statement. "Natalie is my future." Abigail felt her breath catch in her throat. "Ethan, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice frail, nearly drowned out by the growing buzz of the crowd. Ethan exhaled as if this were a minor inconvenience. "Let's be honest, Abigail. You have nothing to offer me." She shook her head, tears welling up but held back by sheer will. "I don't understand. You proposed to me." Ethan's lips twisted into a smile, devoid of warmth. "Did I? Or was it just a conversation our families arranged? I needed Harper Tech's reputation to get started, but now I have a better option." Natalie tightened her grip on Ethan's arm, chuckling softly. "He means me," she said, her voice sweet but sharp as a blade. Abigail felt her stomach twist, as if someone had punched her hard. This is a joke, right?" she whispered, her voice breaking. But Ethan's steely gaze crushed her last hope. "I never loved you, Abigail," he said, his words slicing into her heart like a knife. "You were just a stepping stone, and now I don't need you anymore." The sound of another glass shattering somewhere in the room echoed, followed by a gasp of shock from the crowd. Abigail stood there, hands trembling, staring at Ethan and Natalie as if they were phantoms from a nightmare. Natalie tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "You're a nice girl, Abigail, but let's be real. You don't belong in Ethan's world. You never did." Abigail's entire body went cold. Hundreds of eyes bore into her, whispers rising like rain tapping on glass. Poor thing. So embarrassing. Did she really think he loved her? She turned her head slowly, hoping her mother, Evelyn Harper, would defend her, just this once. But when she met her mother's sharp brown eyes, what she saw wasn't comfort, but contempt. "Abigail," Evelyn said, her voice low, but cutting like a blade, stepping closer through the crowd. "You've humiliated us." Abigail's mouth opened, tears finally spilling over. I didn't." "If you can't secure a husband with wealth and power," Evelyn interrupted, her voice icy, "then you're no longer my daughter." The words were a final blow. Abigail staggered back, her high heels faltering on the polished wooden floor. Evelyn turned away, drawing with her the cold silence of her father, Richard, who only bowed his head to avoid her gaze. The crowd parted, leaving her alone in the vast banquet hall, like a bird with broken wings in a storm. With nothing left to cling to, she turned and ran from the Fairmont Olympic, her heels clacking on the marble floor, the silver gown now drenched under Seattle's rain. The autumn rain draped the city in a gray curtain, water streaming down the sidewalks of Pioneer Square. Abigail wandered aimlessly, her high heels striking sharp clack-clack sounds on the stone pavement, each step mocking her naivety. Rain soaked through the fabric of her gown, making her shiver with cold. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Ethan's voice. "I never loved you," and her mother's, "You're no longer my daughter." They replayed in her mind like a broken record, carving deeper into her bleeding heart. The diamond engagement ring, Ethan's gift from 6 months ago, had been left behind on the banquet hall floor, rolling among champagne shards. Now she had nothing, no fiancé, no family, no future. Her feet ached in the ill-fitting heels, rain streaming down her face, mingling with tears she no longer tried to hold back. She didn't know how long she walked, through the stone-paved streets of Pioneer Square, past the flickering neon lights of coffee shops and small stores, until a warm glow from a little bar caught her eye. The rusty anchor nestled in a street corner, its dim yellow light piercing through fog glass, beckoning her like a temporary refuge. It wasn't a place Abigail typically visited. Too old, too common, too foreign compared to the upscale restaurants of Queen Anne or Belltown she knew. But now she didn't care. She just needed a drink, something to numb the pain screaming inside her. The wooden door creaked as she pushed it open, the smell of beer and damp wood hitting her nose, mixed with the hoarse laughter of a few patrons in the corner. Abigail walked to the bar, her wet gown dripping onto the floor, and sat on a worn stool. The bartender, an old man with a silver beard, glanced at her but asked nothing, as if accustomed to strange customers. "Whiskey?" she said, her voice hoarse from crying and the cold. "Neat." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, pouring a glass of amber whiskey and sliding it toward her. Abigail took it, her hands shaking, and downed it in one gulp. The fiery liquid burned down her throat, searing her chest. But she wanted it, wanted that pain to replace the ache in her heart. She set the glass down, whispering to herself, "Good." The dim bar slowly became a temporary sanctuary, the yellow light blurring the memories of the Fairmont Olympic. Abigail sat there, alone, a second whiskey in hand, trying to find oblivion in the alcohol. She didn't know that. From a shadowed corner of the bar, a pair of green eyes was watching her, and her story was only just beginning. Welcome to Soul Stories. Life can be overwhelming, but here we share heartfelt tales to bring you peace, joy, and inspiration. Your support, every comment, like, and follow means the world to us. It motivates us to create more meaningful and uplifting stories just for you. Did our latest story touch your heart? Leave a misfani meeting. I am happy in the comments if you agree. Subscribe now and be part of a community that spreads love, kindness, and positivity. Let's make every day a little brighter together. Chapter 2. An Encounter Under the Rain. If you need a husband, I'm right here, Jacob Miller joked, his deep voice resonating in the rusty anchor bar, prompting Abigail Harper, drunk and desperate, to raise her whiskey glass. All right, stranger, marry me. The words shot out of her mouth like a stray bullet, hanging in the bar's stifling air, blending with the steady patter of rain on the fogged windows and the hoarse laughter of a few patrons in the dark corner. Abigail wasn't sure if it was a serious intention or just an impulsive remark in her drunken state, but in that moment, as the flickering red and green neon lights illuminated her pale face, she felt a strange freedom, a recklessness she'd never experienced in her 28 years living under the perfect shadow of the Harper Tech family. The whiskey glass in her hand trembled, a few drops sloshing over the rim, but she didn't notice. She just wanted to forget, and Jacob's jest, however absurd, seemed like the only way out. The rusty anchor bar nestled in an old corner of Pioneer Square, Seattle, where red brick walls covered in green moss stood resolute amid the persistent autumn rain. A neon sign hung above the bar, flashing a faded open, but the warm yellow light inside was feeble, only enough to highlight the deep scratches on the aged wooden floor and the dust clinging to the worn stools. The rain tapped steadily on the large windows, each droplet streaking down the glass, forming a mournful melody, as if the city were crying in Abigail's place. She sat on a weathered stool near the counter, her silver evening gown, soaked from the rain, looking out of place in this common setting. Water still dripped from the hem onto the floor, leaving small, spreading puddles, but she didn't bother wiping it away. The third glass of whiskey in her hand, a fiery amber liquid, was all she had left to cling to, numbing the pain from the night at the Fairmont Olympic. Abigail didn't look up as the bartender, an old man with a scruffy silver beard and tired eyes, poured another glass. His hands shook slightly but moved with precision, as if he'd done this thousands of times in his life. He didn't ask anything, just silently set the glass in front of her and turned away, accustomed to odd patrons seeking refuge here to escape something. Abigail didn't want to look at anyone, didn't want to face the world outside, where Ethan Caldwell had torn her heart apart with his cold declaration, "I never loved you," and where her mother, Evelyn Harper, had disowned her in front of a high society crowd. "You're no longer my daughter." Those words replayed in her mind like a broken record, each one cutting deeper into the bleeding wound in her heart. But then, a stranger's voice sliced through the fog of alcohol and sorrow, pulling her from the spiral of self-pity. "You don't seem like the whiskey type," the voice said, low and smooth, tinged with curiosity and a hint of humor, as if testing her reaction. Abigail turned her head slowly, her green eyes clouded by liquor and the tears still lingering from the rain. A few stools away, a man leaned against the bar, hands resting comfortably on his thighs, as if he'd belonged there forever. Jacob Miller wasn't the kind of man she typically encountered at lavish parties in Queen Anne or upscale restaurants in Belltown. He didn't wear an expensive bespoke suit, a Rolex watch, or polished leather shoes. Instead, he sported a weathered denim jacket over a plain gray t-shirt, slightly wrinkled as if it had just come out of the wash. His dark brown hair was tousled, a few wet strands clinging to his forehead, likely from the rain, but he didn't bother fixing it. Yet his eyes, a deep blue like Puget Sound on rare clear days, made her pause. They were bright, sharp, as if holding secrets she couldn't fathom, and in that gaze she saw genuine curiosity, free of judgment. "Maybe I wasn't before," Abigail replied, her voice hoarse from too much crying and the chill of the rain seeping into her bones. She took another sip of whiskey, letting the burns sear her throat, wincing but forcing it down. "But people change." Jacob tilted his head, studying her as if she were an intriguing puzzle he wanted to solve. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone gentle, unpressured, simply wanting to know more. Abigail let out a dry, bitter laugh, the sound rasping from her cracked lips, parched by cold and alcohol. "Worse than rough," she said, and then for some reason, she started talking. Maybe it was the whiskey loosening her tongue, melting the defenses she'd built up all night. Maybe it was because he was a stranger, someone who didn't know she was Abigail Harper, heiress of Harper Tech, and she had nothing left to lose. She told him about the engagement party at the Fairmont Olympic, how Ethan had walked into the hall hand in hand with Natalie Pierce, daughter of Charles Pierce, the infamous venture capital titan of Seattle. She recounted Ethan's declaration, cold as a business memo. Natalie is my future, and how he admitted he'd never loved her, that she'd only been a stepping stone for his career. She spoke of Natalie's mocking smile, her mother Evelyn's contemptuous glare as she disowned her in front of the elite crowd, calling her a disgrace to the family. She described the diamond ring she'd left on the banquet hall floor, rolling among champagne shards, and how Seattle's rain had swept her here, to this rundown bar, where she now sat with a whiskey glass like a lost soul. Jacob didn't interrupt. He just sat there listening, his blue eyes never leaving her, as if seeing through the shell of pain she'd built to hide the devastation within. He didn't nod, didn't show pity, just listened. And oddly, his silence made her feel safe, a sensation she'd lost the moment Ethan walked through the banquet hall doors with Natalie. When she finished, her voice fading, her head drooping, the empty whiskey glass rolling on the counter, Jacob finally spoke, his tone soft but carrying an inexplicable surprise. "If you need a husband, I'm right here." Abigail looked up, blinking in shock, then laughed. A real laugh, tinged with the madness of her drunkenness and pain. "You," she teased, her eyes glinting with alcohol and astonishment, her voice wavering from the burn still lingering in her throat. "You want to marry me?" Jacob smiled, a slow, lazy grin revealing even teeth and a puzzling confidence that piqued her curiosity. "Why not?" he replied, shrugging as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You need a husband, and I don't have anything better to do tonight." It was a crazy idea, utterly ridiculous, a joke any sober person would dismiss. But in Abigail's mind, amid the chaos of pain, betrayal, and intoxication, it held a strange logic. She'd lost everything: Ethan, her family, her reputation, even herself in others' eyes. So why not do something insane to reclaim control, if only for a moment? She raised her glass, though it was empty, and nodded, her voice firmer than she expected. "All right, stranger, marry me." Jacob laughed loudly, a warm, deep sound that echoed in the bar's quiet space, drawing glances from nearby patrons. He stood, slapping the counter as if he'd just made a grand decision. "Okay, girl," he said, tossing a few dollar bills onto the bar to cover their tab. "Let's go." He grabbed her hand, pulling her from the stool, and under Seattle's pouring rain, they dashed into the night. The rain fell in torrents as they left the rusty anchor, cold droplets pelting Abigail's face, soaking her already drenched silver gown completely. Water streamed down Pioneer Square's sidewalks, slipping through the cracks in the stone pavement, making her high heels slide. Jacob gripped her hand tighter, pulling her through narrow streets, their footsteps drowning out the rain and the wind whistling past old buildings. "I know a place in Capitol Hill," he shouted over the downpour, his voice brimming with excitement like a kid with a new game. "A marriage registry open late. Let's go." Abigail didn't resist. She ran after him, her feet aching in the ill-fitting heels, but her head buzzed, as if she were living in an unreal dream. Rain plastered her hair to her face, mascara streaking black trails down her cheeks. But she didn't care. She laughed loudly amid the storm, her laughter mingling with the sound of running water, and in that moment she felt free, a sensation she'd long forgotten. They reached a small building in Capitol Hill, fluorescent lights flickering inside, an old clerk sitting behind a desk with a bored expression, peering at them through thick glasses. "You two want to register a marriage?" he asked, his voice monotone, eyeing Abigail in her soaked evening gown and Jacob in his simple denim outfit, as if he couldn't believe the sight before him. "Yep," Jacob replied without hesitation, while Abigail giggled, leaning on his shoulder for balance, her breath reeking of whiskey. They signed the papers in their drunken haze, the scratch of pens on paper ringing out in the office's stillness. The clerk handed them a cheap silver ring from a drawer. "Free gift," he muttered, his voice devoid of enthusiasm, and 10 minutes later, they were officially husband and wife. Abigail gazed at the ring on her finger, its faint silver gleam under the fluorescent light, and laughed loudly. "I just married a stranger. Fantastic." Jacob laughed too, pulling her outside. "Welcome to your new life, Miss Harper," he said, and they stood in the rain, drenched from head to toe. But oddly, Abigail felt relieved, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. The next morning, Abigail woke with a pounding headache and a creeping sense of wrongness, as if she'd crossed a line she couldn't undo. She opened her eyes, blinking to adjust to the dim light filtering through a tattered curtain in an unfamiliar room. This wasn't her Queen Anne penthouse, with its soft silk sheets and wide windows overlooking the dazzling Space Needle. The bed beneath her was hard, the thin gray blanket frayed at the edges, and the air carried the stale scent of old coffee mixed with damp wood, a foreign smell that made her frown. She sat up slowly, clutching her head to ease the pain, and then she saw it, the cheap silver ring on her left finger, glinting faintly in the morning light. Her heart seemed to stop. She turned her head slowly, dreading what she'd find, and there on a worn armchair a few steps from the bed was Jacob Miller. He lay sprawled, shirtless, one arm dangling over the edge, his chest rising and falling steadily with deep breaths. Abigail gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth to stifle the scream rising in her throat. "What have I done?" she whispered, her mind reeling with hazy memories from the night before. The bar, the whiskey, Jacob's joke, and the marriage registry under Seattle's rain. Jacob's small apartment in Rainier Valley came into sharp focus before her like a jolt of reality. The white-painted walls peeled in large patches, exposing rough brick beneath. The wooden floor creaked with every shift she made, and an old bicycle propped in the corner was all she could see in the cramped space. No flat-screen TV hung on the wall, no leather sofa graced the room, no trace of the wealth or comfort she'd known her whole life in Queen Anne. She clutched her head tighter, the headache and panic blending into an unsettling mix, making her want to scream to dispel the suffocating feeling. A noise from the corner snapped her out of her chaotic thoughts. Jacob sat up, rubbing his eyes with his left hand, then turned to her with a lazy smile, as if her waking up here was nothing unusual. "Morning, wifey," he said, his deep voice laced with teasing, his blue eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. He stood, pulling a gray t-shirt over his head, his tousled hair growing messier as he ran a hand through it. He stepped into the tiny kitchen, a space barely big enough for one, flicked on the gas stove, and rummaged through a cabinet for a few eggs and a slightly stale loaf of bread. The smell of frying eggs began to fill the air, a simple but warm scent that eased some of the chill lingering from last night's rain. Jacob turned back to her, that same smile still on his lips, as if savoring the moment. "Not a dream, Abigail," he said, setting a small plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the scratched wooden table in the middle of the room. "Welcome to the first day of married life." Abigail stared at him, her mouth agape but speechless, her green eyes wide with shock and confusion. The steaming plate of eggs and toast sat before her, Jacob's simplicity unfolding as something both foreign and captivating, like a new breeze blowing through her life, already ravaged since the night at the Fairmont Olympic. She didn't know how to react, scream, run, or just sit still and let it happen. But as Jacob sat across from her, his eyes meeting hers with an inexplicable warmth, she felt a spark of curiosity pierce through her panic. About this man, this strange life, and herself, now the wife of a stranger. Chapter 3. A New Life in Rainier Valley. "You're not the Harper Tech princess anymore, sweetheart," Jacob Miller said, placing a $1 water bottle into the cart at Pike Place Market, making Abigail Harper blush as she learned for the first time how to live without extravagant wealth. His voice was low but laced with a teasing edge, his blue eyes twinkling as he watched her fumble awkwardly among the bustling stalls, brimming with fresh fish, vegetables, and the rich aroma of roasted coffee. Abigail stood there, holding the cheap water bottle, feeling like a child thrust out of the cozy nest of Queen Anne to face the stark reality of Rainier Valley. She wanted to argue, to say she didn't need the reminder, but as she looked at the plain plastic bottle in her hand, replacing the $10 imported glass bottles she'd once known, she stayed silent, her cheeks warming with shame and a faint, nameless confusion. Jacob's small apartment in Rainier Valley was a world entirely different from the life Abigail had known. The white-painted walls peeled in large patches, exposing the rough brick beneath like old weathered scars. The wooden floor creaked with every step she took, the squeaking sound echoing like a taunt to her clumsiness in this cramped space. Outside the window, the distant hum of the light rail droned steadily, mingling with the relentless patter of rain on the glass, a signature Seattle sound she could no longer escape. The apartment consisted of just a tiny bedroom, a minuscule kitchen corner with an ancient gas stove, and a living room barely big enough for a frayed armchair and a scratched wooden table. There was no flat-screen TV, no surround sound system, no hint of the wealth she'd once taken for granted in her Queen Anne penthouse. Now Abigail faced a cold reality. No family, no overflowing bank account, no maids or servants, just Jacob and the simple life he offered. The first day after that wild night at the Capitol Hill marriage registry, Abigail woke with a pounding headache and a question looping in her mind. What have I done? But when Jacob set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her, his lazy smile seeming to soothe her panic, she had no choice but to confront the present. "Eat up," he said, his voice warm and low. "Then I'll teach you how to survive here." Abigail eyed the plain meal, no eggs Benedict or croissants from a fancy restaurant, and picked up her fork with some reluctance. But when the eggs hit her tongue, she realized she was hungrier than she'd thought. Jacob sat across from her, watching with a mix of curiosity and amusement, as if waiting to see whether she'd crumble or adapt. The days that followed were a series of challenges Abigail had never imagined. Jacob taught her to wash dishes in the tiny sink, the icy water numbing her hands, and she had to learn not to drop the plates as they slipped from her grasp with cheap soap. "You've never washed dishes before?" Jacob asked, half joking, half serious, as she dropped the third plate onto the floor, thankfully unbroken. Abigail glared at him, her hair a sweaty, tangled mess sticking to her forehead, but she didn't answer. She couldn't admit that at home, she'd had maids for everything, from dishes to dusting. Now she had to wash her own clothes in a noisy old machine in the apartment building's basement. Her clothes, a few expensive pieces she'd brought from that fateful night, emerging wrinkled without a decent iron. "I hate this machine," she muttered, pulling out a silk dress, once worth hundreds of dollars, now crumpled like a rag. Jacob stood beside her, chuckling softly. "It doesn't hate you. You're just not used to it yet." Her first trip to Pike Place Market with Jacob was another shock. She was accustomed to ordering groceries through an app, delivered to her door in organic Whole Foods boxes. But Jacob guided her through the crowded stalls, where the smells of fresh fish, roasted coffee, and newly baked bread blended into a strange but vibrant mix. He carried a plastic basket, picking out produce with a skill she hadn't expected, while she stood there, unsure where to begin. When she reached for a $10 bottled water, Jacob raised an eyebrow, gently taking it from her hand and swapping it for a $1 version. "You're not the Harper Tech princess anymore, sweetheart," he said, his tone teasing but not unkind. Abigail blushed, a mix of embarrassment and irritation washing over her, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. She wasn't Abigail Harper of Queen Anne anymore. She was just Abigail. Something, a woman learning to live on a few dollars. But not everything was a struggle. Jacob had a way of making her laugh, even when she didn't want to. One evening, she tried cooking dinner, a simple spaghetti dish from an online recipe, but forgot to stir, letting it burn black in the pot. Smoke filled the apartment, and she frantically waved her hands to clear it, while Jacob walked in from the bedroom, took one look at the scene, and burst out laughing. "Planning to burn my place down?" he asked, his voice full of humor, then pulled the pot off the stove and opened the window to vent the smoke. "No big deal. I'll order pizza," he said, patting her shoulder, as if it weren't worth getting upset over. Abigail looked at him, annoyed yet grateful, and for the first time she laughed along. a real, unguarded laugh. Another time when she tripped over a loose floorboard and nearly fell, Jacob caught her quickly, his strong arm wrapping around her waist. "Careful there, princess," he said, his voice softer than usual. And for that brief moment, as his warmth seeped through her thin shirt, Abigail felt an odd sense of safety. But then he let go, returning to his task, fixing an old table lamp, as if it were nothing special. Abigail stood there, her heart beating a little faster, wondering if she was imagining something more. Strange signs began to emerge, stirring doubts about this man. One morning, as Jacob brewed coffee from a cheap supermarket packet, he lifted the mug, inhaling the aroma with an odd focus, then took a small sip, closing his eyes as if savoring a high-end espresso from Italy. Abigail frowned, watching him. "What are you doing?" Jacob opened his eyes, shrugging. "Just like coffee." But she didn't buy it. The way he tasted it mirrored the coffee experts she'd seen at Harper Tech's upscale events, not the habits of a Rainier Valley regular. Then one day, as they passed a bike shop in Columbia City, Abigail teased, "If you could pick any vehicle, what would it be?" Jacob answered instantly without hesitation. "Boeing 787 Dreamliner, Rolls-Royce Trent 1000 engines, 14,000-kilometer range." He spoke with such certainty and detail that Abigail turned to him, mouth agape. "I thought you'd say a bike or a car," she said, half joking, half serious. Jacob chuckled lightly, shrugging. "I like planes." But a flicker in his eyes suggested he'd let slip something he hadn't meant to. The peak of her suspicion came one rainy afternoon when Abigail rummaged through a table drawer for a pen to jot down a shopping list. She pulled it open, and there, beneath a mess of papers, was a stack of cash. Crisp $100 bills, thick enough that she guessed it was at least $5,000. Her heart pounded, her hands trembling as she picked up the stack, feeling the smooth paper under her fingertips. Jacob was poor, wasn't he? They lived in a rundown apartment, ate instant noodles and cheap pizza, bought $1 water instead of 10. So where did this come from? She didn't have time to think further before Jacob's footsteps echoed from the bedroom. He walked in, still in his gray t-shirt and old jeans, hair tousled as if he'd just woken up. "Looking for something?" he asked, his tone casual. Abigail flinched, nearly dropping the money, turning to him with eyes full of doubt. "Where did this come from?" she asked, her voice higher than usual, holding the stack up in front of him. Jacob paused, looking at the money, then at her, the lazy smile vanishing from his face. He stepped forward, gently taking the stack from her hands, placing it back in the drawer, and slamming it shut. "I don't like wasting money," he said, his voice even, but his eyes avoided hers. "That's not an answer," Abigail said, her voice quivering with suspicion. "We live like we're broke, but you've got a pile of cash stashed away. Who are you, Jacob?" Jacob sighed, turning to meet her gaze, his blue eyes now darkening like Seattle's sky before a storm. "Do you have to dig into everything?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "I'm your husband. That's enough." Abigail shook her head, stepping closer to him. "No, it's not enough. What are you hiding? Are you a criminal? Or something worse?" Suspicion swelled in her chest like a wave, dragging along dark thoughts. Had she married a con artist, a thief, or someone on the run from the law? Jacob didn't answer right away. He stood still, his hands clenching into fists, then turned and walked out to the small balcony overlooking Rainier Valley's wet streets. Abigail stood there, her heart racing, unsure what to do. The doubts lingered, unvanished, but she couldn't deny that. Whoever he was, Jacob had given her something Ethan and her family never had, a strange sense of safety amid the storm of her life. That night, the rain fell heavily again, and the apartment's power suddenly cut out, leaving them in darkness lit only by the faint glow of streetlights through the window. Abigail sat curled up on the armchair, hugging her knees, feeling more lost than ever. She heard Jacob's footsteps, then felt a thin blanket draped around her shoulders. He said nothing, just sat on the floor beside her, silently gazing out at the rain. The warmth of the blanket and his presence eased her coldness, her loneliness. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice so soft it was nearly drowned by the rain. Jacob didn't reply, just nodded slightly, his blue eyes staring into the distance. Abigail looked at him, and in the dark she wondered if she'd misjudged him. The suspicion remained, like a black cloud hovering overhead. But his warmth, even just a small gesture, planted a spark of hope in her heart, a feeling that perhaps, whoever he was, she wasn't entirely alone in this new life. Chapter 4. The Secret Unveiled. "Jacob Ethan Ryder, who are you?" Abigail Harper shouted, throwing the old newspaper onto the table in the Rainier Valley apartment, confronting the husband she'd thought was a penniless man, now revealed as a missing aviation billionaire. Her scream echoed through the cramped space, drowning out the steady patter of rain on the window and the distant hum of the light rail. The newspaper, a yellowed, crumpled sheet from 3 years ago, landed on the scratched wooden table, right between a plate of dry toast and a cold coffee mug Jacob had brewed that morning. Abigail stood there, her hands trembling, her green eyes blazing with anger and confusion, staring intently at Jacob. He stood across from her, still holding the spoon he'd been stirring his coffee with, his face motionless for a moment. But a flicker of panic flashed through his deep blue eyes before they settled back into an unreadable calm. The small apartment suddenly felt more stifling than ever, as if the peeling walls and low ceiling were closing in around them, forcing her to face the truth she'd just uncovered. A truth that upended everything she'd believed about this man. It all began on a weekend morning at Pike Place Market, where Abigail and Jacob had gradually formed a routine together after nearly 2 weeks of living in the rundown Rainier Valley apartment. Pike Place Market was a vibrant world, far removed from the cold stillness of Queen Anne she'd once known. The smell of fresh fish from the seafood stalls mingled with the rich aroma of roasted coffee from small vendors, the shouts of hawkers blending with the sound of waves lapping at Elliott Bay not far off. Bright tulip bouquets lined up in rows, baskets of red apples and freshly baked bread, painted a lively picture that Abigail was starting to feel at home with. She walked beside Jacob holding a plastic basket, learning to pick out produce under his guidance, something she'd never imagined doing in her Harper Tech heiress life. "These potatoes are cheaper at that stall," Jacob said, his voice low and even, pointing to a pile of earthy brown spuds in the corner. He wore his weathered denim jacket and gray t-shirt, his old sneakers caked with mud from yesterday's rain, looking no different from an ordinary Rainier Valley laborer. Abigail nodded, still awkward as she held a potato, the rough skin making her grimace. "I don't know why we don't just buy frozen stuff to save time," she muttered, but Jacob only chuckled softly, that lazy smile now a familiar part of her new life. They passed the fish counter, where vendors tossed salmon back and forth like a performance, making Abigail laugh, a light sound she hadn't expected to still be capable of after the shattering night at the Fairmont Olympic. Jacob paused, looking at her with warm eyes. "You've got a nice laugh, princess." Abigail blushed, turning away to hide her smile, but inside a strange feeling stirred. A touch of comfort, a hint of safety she hadn't felt since Ethan Caldwell betrayed her and her mother, Evelyn Harper, disowned her. But that peaceful moment dissolved when a familiar voice, sharp and dripping with sarcasm, cut through from behind. "Well, look who we have here!" The voice sliced through the vendor's calls like a knife. Abigail stiffened, her hands gripping the plastic basket so tightly her knuckles turned white. She turned slowly, and there stood Ethan Caldwell in the crowded walkway of Pike Place, dressed in an expensive gray suit, his blonde hair neatly combed as always. Beside him was Natalie Pierce, her arm looped possessively through his, a black dress hugging her figure, accentuating her glossy blonde hair, her red lips curling into a smug smile. Abigail's stomach twisted, as if time had rewound to that night at the Fairmont Olympic, when Ethan declared, "Natalie is my future." Jacob stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on her back, his voice low but edged with caution. "Friends of yours?" Abigail took a deep breath, trying to keep her tone steady. "Something like that." Ethan smirked, the cold smile she'd once found charming now making her sick. "I have to say, I almost didn't recognize you, Abigail," he said, his eyes scanning the old sweater she'd borrowed from Jacob and the cheap sneakers she'd bought at a discount store. "No more evening gowns, no more diamonds. Such a pity." Natalie giggled softly, eyeing Jacob up and down with disdain. And this must be your husband, huh? A real Rainier Valley native. Abigail felt her blood boil. She stepped forward, her voice firm. He loves me, unlike you, Ethan. The words slipped out before she could think, but she didn't regret them. She locked eyes with Ethan, seeing his smile falter for a moment, but then he laughed loudly, his tone dripping with mockery. Love? Oh, Abigail, that's cute, but love doesn't pay the bills. Natalie leaned into Ethan, her red lips curving. Let's be real, Abigail. What does your husband have besides that ratty jacket? Abigail clenched her fists, ready to retort, but Jacob spoke first, his voice smooth yet chilling. I have enough. He smiled, a small, cryptic smile, as if he held a secret neither Ethan nor Natalie could grasp. His blue eyes flashed with something, calculation, confidence, making Ethan frown, as if for the first time he felt uncertain. Natalie just scoffed, delusional, but Jacob tilted his head, his smile unwavering, and Abigail, standing beside him, felt a jolt run through her, as if the game was about to shift in a way Ethan and Natalie could never anticipate. The encounter ended as Ethan and Natalie turned away, Natalie's heels clicking on the market floor, but Abigail remained rooted, her heart pounding, watching their figures disappear into the crowd. Jacob patted her shoulder lightly. Don't let them get to you. Come on, we still need coffee. She nodded, but in her mind, Jacob's mysterious smile lingered, a big question mark she couldn't yet answer. The truth hit Abigail on a rainy afternoon, alone in the Rainier Valley apartment. Jacob had gone out to work. He said he was fixing a bike for a friend, but she wasn't sure if that was true. She sat in the armchair, watching rain stream down the window, the suspicions from recent days about how Jacob tasted coffee, his knowledge of Boeing planes, and the $5,000 cash in the drawer, resurfacing. She stood, resolved to search for answers, though it made her feel guilty. She opened the wooden table drawer where she'd seen the money, but this time found nothing but a few old bills. She moved to the small bookshelf by the wall, flipping through worn books, a few cheap novels, a bike repair manual, until a yellowed paper slipped from between the pages. Abigail picked it up, her heart racing as she read the bold headline. Jacob Ethan Ryder, heir to Ryder Aviation, vanishes after financial scandal. Below was a photo, a young man with dark brown hair and deep blue eyes, unmistakable. Jacob, her husband, but in an expensive suit instead of a frayed denim jacket. The article detailed Ryder Aviation, a billion-dollar aviation empire, and how Jacob Ethan Ryder, the sole heir, had disappeared 3 years ago after his father was accused of embezzling company funds. No one knew where he'd gone, until now. Abigail sank into the chair, her hands shaking as she held the paper, her mind spinning. Jacob wasn't some poor guy from Rainier Valley. He was a billionaire, someone who could buy Harper Tech if he wanted, but he'd hidden it, letting her believe he was penniless. Her blood surged, a mix of anger and hurt. When Jacob walked into the apartment hours later, smelling of rain and machine oil, his hands dirty, she stood, facing him with the newspaper in hand. Jacob Ethan Ryder, who are you? She yelled, tossing the paper onto the table, her voice breaking with emotion. Jacob stopped, his arms dropping, glancing at the paper, then at her. He didn't speak at first, just sighed, running a hand through his wet hair, his face now weary instead of sporting its usual lazy smile. Abigail, calm down, he said, his voice low but steady. I can explain. Explain? She cut in, stepping closer, her eyes blazing. You let me think you were some broke guy living in this dump when you're a billionaire? You lied to me, Jacob, or Ryder, or whatever your name is. Jacob looked at her, his blue eyes darkening like Seattle's sky before a storm. I didn't lie to you, he said, his voice low but firm. I just hid part of the truth. Part of it? Abigail laughed bitterly, tears welling up but held back. You hid an entire aviation empire, a whole life I didn't know about. Why, Jacob? Why did you do it? He stepped forward, reaching to touch her shoulder, but she stepped back, her warning glare stopping him. He sighed again, sitting in the armchair, his hands clasped as if searching for the right words. I walked away from Ryder Aviation 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady and low. My father embezzled money from the company, and when it all came crashing down, he blamed me. The press hounded me, my family turned their backs, and people I'd called friends used me. I was tired of being seen as a walking safe, Abigail. I wanted to know if anyone could love me for me. Not for Ryder, not for money. Abigail stood there listening, but each word only deepened her hurt. So you picked me as your experiment? She asked, her voice trembling. You let me live in this poverty. Let me believe you had nothing, just to test if I'd love you? No. Jacob stood, his voice rising, the first time she'd seen him lose his cool. I didn't pick you to test. I met you at the Rusty Anchor, and you were more real than anyone I'd ever known. You didn't need money, didn't need fame. You just needed an out. And I wanted to be with you. Abigail shook her head, tears finally falling. You don't get it, Jacob. Ethan betrayed me. My family abandoned me. I thought you were real, a simple man, no schemes. But now I know you lied too, and I don't know what to believe anymore. Jacob stepped closer, and this time she didn't pull away, though her eyes remained wary. I didn't lie about my feelings, he said, his voice softening, almost pleading. I wanted to know if you'd love me for me, not for Ryder Aviation. And when I saw you at Pike Place today, defending me against Ethan, I knew. You're the realest person I've ever met. Abigail looked at him, her heart torn between the hurt and the feelings she'd started to develop over their days together. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his kindness, the times he caught her when she stumbled, laughed when she burned dinner, was real. But the truth about his identity stabbed like another knife into the fragile trust she'd begun to build. I need time, she whispered, her voice breaking, then turned, opened the apartment door and stepped outside, leaving Jacob standing there, his hands hanging limp in silence. Seattle's rain poured heavily as Abigail left the Rainier Valley apartment, her cheap sneakers soaking through instantly, but she didn't care. She walked aimlessly through the wet streets, past small houses tucked under evergreen trees, until she reached Gasworks Park. The park sat on Lake Union's shore, the old gas plant's rusted smokestacks looming under a gray sky, like a symbol of the ruin inside her. She sat on a wooden bench, rain streaming down her face, mingling with tears she could no longer hold back. She hugged her head, wrestling with two conflicting emotions. Part of her was furious at being deceived again. Ethan had used her as a stepping stone, and now Jacob had hidden an entire billionaire life from her. But another part recalled the moments with him, how he'd wrapped a blanket around her during a blackout, how he'd laughed at her clumsy dishwashing, how he'd shielded her with quiet confidence against Ethan and Natalie. Had she misjudged him? Were his feelings real, or just another game where she was a pawn? The rain kept falling, freezing cold, but Abigail sat there, staring out at Lake Union's misty expanse, unsure what to do. She couldn't return to the apartment yet, not while her trust lay in pieces, but she couldn't deny that, despite the doubt and pain, an invisible thread still tugged her toward Jacob, a man she'd come to love, even without knowing who he truly was. Chapter 5. A Choice Under Seattle's Lights. I want you to choose me for love, not because you were drunk, Jacob Miller said, kneeling on the rooftop of the Space Needle, offering a dazzling diamond ring under Seattle's lights as he asked Abigail Harper, "Do you still love me?" His voice was warm but trembling, as if his entire world hinged on her answer. Abigail stood there, her green eyes wide with astonishment, her breath catching in her throat as she gazed at the ring, not the cheap silver one from that drunken night in Capitol Hill, but a stunning diamond, shining as brightly as the beacon atop the Space Needle, the symbol of the city she'd called home for 28 years. The city lights glittered below them, reflecting through a light rain, and the sound of jazz from a small speaker echoed in the space, mingling with the thudding of her heart. This wasn't her first proposal. Ethan Caldwell had done it a year ago, but this time, it felt more real than anything she'd ever experienced. The rooftop of the Space Needle was a place Abigail had never visited before. Despite living her whole life in Seattle, The open expanse atop the city's tallest tower was framed by clear glass panels, letting her see the urban sprawl stretching from Puget Sound to the misty Cascade Mountains in the east. Tonight, a light rain fell, tiny droplets rolling down the glass like shimmering streaks, crafting a mystical veil under the chandelier hanging in the center. A small jazz band played in a far corner, the saxophone's low, soulful notes drifting through the air, blending with the faint scent of roses from vases on the lone wooden table in the middle. A table set perfectly with white silk napkins, flickering candles, and 2 glasses of red wine. Jacob had invited her here after a week apart, following the night she'd stormed out of the Rainier Valley apartment in the rain, when she learned he was Jacob Ethan Ryder, a missing aviation billionaire. Not the poor guy she'd assumed. Abigail stood before the table, the gray sweater she'd borrowed from Jacob now replaced by a simple blue dress she'd found in her sparse wardrobe, her light brown hair loose and damp from the rain. For the past week, she'd avoided him, staying in a cheap motel in Pioneer Square, wrestling with the hurt of his deception and the undeniable feelings she had for him. She'd considered leaving Seattle, returning to Queen Anne to face her family, but every time she thought of Jacob, his lazy smile, the way he'd wrapped a blanket around her during a blackout, she couldn't walk away. When he called her that morning, his voice low and urgent over the phone, "Meet me at the Space Needle, 8 p.m. I need to talk to you." She couldn't say no. Jacob rose from his chair as she entered, his deep blue eyes lighting up under the glow, but his face was tense, lacking its usual confidence. He wore a plain white shirt with rolled-up sleeves and old jeans, as if clinging to the simplicity of Jacob Miller rather than the opulence of Jacob Ethan Ryder. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, pulling out a chair for her. Abigail sat, her hands gripping the table's edge, unsure what to say. She looked at the plate before her, grilled salmon with lemon sauce and mashed potatoes, but didn't touch it, just stared at him, waiting. "I know you're mad at me," Jacob began, sitting across from her, his hands clasped on the table as if trying to stay calm. "And you have every right to be. I hid the truth about myself, about Ryder Aviation, the money, everything. But I don't regret meeting you at the Rusty Anchor. Don't regret marrying you, even if it was a crazy night." He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I only regret hurting you when you found out the truth." Abigail bit her lip, a tumult of emotions rising within her. "You don't understand, Jacob," she said, her voice shaky. "I was betrayed by Ethan, abandoned by my family. I thought you were real, a simple man, no ulterior motives. But then I found out you're a billionaire, and I don't know if what we had was real or just another game." Jacob shook his head, his hands tightening. "It's not a game, Abigail. I walked away from Ryder Aviation because I was exhausted. Tired of being seen as a cash vault, tired of people loving me for my money. When I met you, you didn't know who I was. And you stayed with me in that run-down apartment even though you didn't have to. That's why I love you." His words were like a warm breeze across her cold heart, but she hesitated. "Then why didn't you tell me from the start?" she asked, her voice quieter, almost pleading for an answer she could trust. "Because I was afraid," Jacob replied, his voice dropping, full of sincerity. "Afraid that if you knew I was Ryder, you'd see me differently, like Ethan, like your family, like everyone who wanted me for my money. I wanted you to love me, Jacob Miller, not Jacob Ethan Ryder." Abigail fell silent, looking into his eyes, seeing the truth there. Not about wealth or fame, but about the man who'd stood by her through her darkest days. She remembered how he'd laughed when she burned dinner, how he'd caught her when she tripped on the loose floorboards, how he'd sat quietly with her during a blackout. Those moments weren't lies. They were real, more real than anything she'd had with Ethan. Jacob stood, stepping in front of her, then suddenly knelt, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. He opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring, its light reflecting onto his face, highlighting his emotion-filled blue eyes. "I don't want you to have married me because you were drunk," he said, his voice trembling. "I want you to choose me for love. Forget the money, forget Ryder Aviation. I'm just Jacob. Do you still love me?" Abigail felt tears well up, not from pain but from being moved by his honesty. She looked at the ring, then at him, the man who'd given her a home when she'd lost everything, even if it was just a shabby Rainier Valley apartment. She stood, stepping closer, her hand touching his face, feeling the warmth of his skin. "I love you, Jacob," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not Ryder, just you." Jacob smiled, a radiant grin she'd never seen before, and slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her into his arms. They stood there on the Space Needle rooftop, under Seattle's shimmering lights in the gentle rain, holding each other as if the world contained only them. Abigail rested her head on his chest, hearing his heartbeat pound, and for the first time in months, she felt she was no longer lost. In the weeks that followed, Abigail and Jacob started anew, living simply in the Rainier Valley apartment as before. He didn't take her to lavish mansions or buy her extravagant gifts. He wanted to keep his promise that their love wasn't built on money. But Jacob quietly did something she didn't know. He reached out to old contacts from Ryder Aviation, secretly helping her establish a charity called New Dawn, dedicated to women abandoned or betrayed, inspired by Abigail's own story. He didn't tell her, wanting her to discover its meaning later. One evening, they attended a small charity event at a Belltown gallery where New Dawn officially launched. Abigail stood amid the crowd, in her simple blue dress, stunned to learn Jacob had been behind it all. She looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude. But the moment was interrupted when Ethan Caldwell and Natalie Pierce appeared. They were no longer the powerful couple they once were. Natalie's father's venture capital firm had collapsed after a financial scandal, and Ethan was now a failed entrepreneur, his gray suit rumpled, his eyes brimming with envy. "Congratulations, Abigail," Ethan said, his tone sarcastic but unable to mask his bitterness. "From Rainier Valley to Belltown, pretty impressive." Natalie smirked. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Abigail smiled, unshaken. "I heard your father's company hit some trouble, Natalie. That's a shame." Jacob stepped forward, resting a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but cutting. "Business is unpredictable. One wrong move, and it all falls apart." Ethan's face darkened. Natalie clenched her fist, but they said nothing, turning away and fading into the crowd. Abigail watched them go, then turned to Jacob, smiling. "I think I owe Ethan a thank you." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For leaving me," she said, her voice firm. "If he hadn't, I wouldn't have found you." A few days later, Abigail emerged from another New Dawn meeting at Pike Place Market, having just persuaded a major donor. As she left the market, a swarm of paparazzi surrounded her, cameras flashing, voices shouting. "Abigail Harper, what do you think of Ethan Caldwell betraying you for Natalie Pierce?" She paused, took a deep breath, then stepped to the microphone, her green eyes blazing with a confidence she'd never had before. "I'm not Ethan Caldwell's victim," she said, her voice ringing clear over the light rain. "I'm Abigail Harper, and I choose my own future." She turned, stepping onto Jacob's old bike. He stood waiting at the market's edge, his lazy smile on his lips, leaving the stunned crowd behind. That declaration wasn't just for the press, but for herself, a vow that she'd found her path, no longer defined by her past. Chapter 6, Light from the Ashes. The sun cast golden rays over Elkey Beach, where gentle waves lapped softly against the fine sand. The air carried the salty tang of the sea, mingling with the clear, bright laughter of children. Abigail sat on a blanket spread across the sand, her eyes following two little ones, Emma and Noah, running barefoot, sand kicking up with each tiny step. The sea breeze brushed lightly through her hair, bringing a peace she once thought she'd never find. Jacob sat down beside her, one arm wrapping around her shoulders, the other holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Those two are full of energy, aren't they?" Abigail smiled, leaning into her husband's shoulder. "Just like you." Jacob laughed, his eyes sparkling with a joy only she could see. They had weathered so many storms, faced countless challenges to reach this day. Neither of them was the person they used to be. Jacob was no longer a man fleeing his past, and Abigail was no longer the girl defined by brokenness. Together, they had rebuilt, rising from the ashes. After overcoming a tumultuous past, they decided to turn their pain into purpose. The Harper Ryder Foundation was born with a mission to support women who had lost everything, whether due to divorce, financial ruin, or dire circumstances, offering them a chance to rebuild their lives. They provided scholarships, skills training programs, and temporary housing for those needing a place to start anew. Our foundation has helped over 500 women already, Abigail said, her eyes shining with pride. I never thought I could do something like this. Jacob squeezed her hand gently. You've always been stronger than you realize, Abigail. She turned to look at him, feeling the sincerity in his gaze. So have you, Jacob. You've overcome the things you feared most. He nodded, his eyes following Emma and Noah, his heart filled with a simple happiness he hadn't known he craved so deeply before. They didn't choose a life of luxury, didn't return to glittering penthouses or the hollow high society parties. Instead, they opted for a small house in Seattle's suburbs where a garden bloomed with lavender, where each morning Abigail brewed coffee and listened to the kids chatter, calling for their parents. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it held meaning. That afternoon, they took the children to Cary Park. From there, the entire city of Seattle stretched out before them, the sunset painting the sky in shades of red. Emma and Noah chased each other across the grass, their laughter ringing out in the carefree joy of childhood. Abigail turned to Jacob, her gaze tender. Thank you, Jacob, for staying, for not running away. Jacob smiled, taking her hand. I'm the one who should thank you, for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it. They sat there side by side, looking toward a future free of shadows, free of deceit, where only love and wholeness remained. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love